The streetlights cast long shadows as Andrew Williams drove home after a late community meeting. It had been a good night. The neighborhood cleanup project was finally getting funding, and people seemed genuinely excited about the new youth programs. Andrew smiled to himself, thinking about how far their small community center had come in just 3 years. The flash of blue and red lights in his rearview mirror caught him by surprise. Andrew checked his speed. He was under the limit. He signaled and pulled over carefully, then reached for his wallet. Living in Oakwood City all his life had taught him exactly how these stops should go. "License and registration," said Officer Delaney, shining a flashlight directly into Andrew's eyes. The second officer, Mercer, according to his nameplate, circled around to the passenger side, peering into the car with unusual interest. "May I ask why I was pulled over, sir?" Andrew kept his voice steady and polite. Officer Delaney didn't answer. "Step out of the vehicle." Andrew's heart began to race, but he complied. "Is there a problem, officer?" "Just a routine check," Mercer called out, already opening the passenger door without permission. "Seems like we've had some drug activity reported in this area." Andrew stood in the cold night air, hands visible at his sides, as the officers searched his car. He knew they wouldn't find anything. He didn't even drink, let alone use drugs. His work at the community center focused on keeping kids away from that life. Well, what do we have here?" Officer Mercer emerged from the car holding a small plastic bag with white powder. He looked almost pleased. "That's not mine," Andrew said immediately, his mouth going dry. "That wasn't in my car." "That's what they all say," Delaney laughed, already reaching for his handcuffs. "Andrew Williams, you're under arrest for possession of controlled substances." As Delaney recited his rights, Andrew's mind raced. How had that bag gotten into his car? It wasn't possible. Then a chill ran down his spine as he remembered locking his car that morning. Someone had to have put it there. This wasn't random. The ride to the precinct passed in a blur. Andrew tried to stay calm, telling himself this was all a mistake that would be cleared up. He had no record. He was known in the community. People would vouch for him. As they led him through the station doors, Andrew noticed a man watching from the hallway. A man in an expensive suit with cold eyes. With a jolt, Andrew recognized Judge Victor Reynolds, known for his harsh sentences, especially for black defendants. The judge nodded slightly to Officer Delaney before disappearing down a corridor. In the processing room, Andrew's fingerprints were taken, his personal items catalogued. "I need to call my lawyer," he insisted. "All in good time," Officer Mercer said, smirking. "Judge Reynolds will be handling your arraignment personally tomorrow morning. He takes drug cases very seriously." Andrew felt like the floor was tilting beneath him. Judge Reynolds? The same Judge Reynolds who was just here. Isn't that a conflict of interest? Both officers exchanged glances. "Watch your mouth," Delaney warned. "Making accusations won't help your case." Later, alone in a holding cell, Andrew closed his eyes and tried to think clearly. The officers planting evidence. The judge already involved before he'd even been processed. The way they all seemed to know each other, something was very wrong. Then it hit him 3 months ago at the community center. The basement meeting he'd stumbled upon. The voices he recognized. Judge Reynolds discussing payoffs with 2 police officers Andrew hadn't seen at the time, but whose voices now matched Delaney and Mercer perfectly. Andrew had recorded part of that conversation on his phone as evidence, just in case something happened. He'd never imagined it would be needed like this. The recording was still hidden, safely backed up where they couldn't find it. They thought they had him cornered, but Andrew had something they didn't know about. He had proof of their corruption. Now he just needed to figure out how to use it before his arraignment tomorrow, before Judge Reynolds had the chance to bury him in the system. Andrew took a deep breath. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about everyone these men had hurt before. It was about justice. 3 months earlier, the community center had been quiet. Most volunteers had left for the day, but Andrew stayed late to finish paperwork for a grant application. The old building had its quirks, drafty windows, flickering lights, and pipes that groaned like they were telling stories. Andrew had grown to love these imperfections. They reminded him that broken things could still serve a purpose. He was heading to the supply closet for more printer paper when he heard voices from the basement, odd, since that area was mostly unused except for storage. The building had once been a small bank, and the basement still had the old vault, now emptied and serving as additional storage space. Andrew paused at the top of the stairs. The voices were hushed but heated. Curiosity got the better of him, and he quietly made his way down, careful to avoid the third step that always creaked. "The shipment comes through on Thursday," a man was saying. "We need to make sure the evidence locker is cleared of any competing product." "I've got the paperwork ready to authorize destruction of the previous batch," another voice responded. "Just need the judge's signature." Andrew froze. He recognized that second voice, Officer Delaney, who occasionally dropped by the Center for Community Outreach. Andrew had always felt something off about the man, but couldn't place why. "You'll have it tomorrow," a third voice said. Andrew peered through the crack in the door and saw 3 men standing around the old vault. One was Officer Delaney. Another was Officer Mercer. The third, a distinguished-looking older man in an expensive suit, was none other than Judge Victor Reynolds. "We've maintained this arrangement for 2 years without incident," the judge continued. "Let's not get sloppy now. The commissioner is starting to ask questions about the missing evidence." "Relax," Officer Mercer said, leaning against the wall. "We've been careful. The replaced evidence passes inspection, and the real stuff gets distributed through our channels. Everyone gets paid, and the system keeps turning." Andrew's heart pounded. They were talking about stealing confiscated drugs, replacing them with fake evidence, and selling the real drugs back on the street. With a judge involved, they could control who got convicted and who walked free. His phone was in his hand before he even thought about it. He opened the voice recorder app and hit record, slowly moving closer to capture their conversation. "What about the Rodriguez case?" Delaney asked. "The kid had no priors. We planted that evidence as you requested, but his lawyer's asking too many questions." The judge laughed coldly. "I'll handle him tomorrow. I'm sentencing him to 15 years. Make an example of him. These community activists need to learn their neighborhoods belong to us." Andre felt sick. How many innocent people had they framed? How many lives had they destroyed? He didn't realize he was backing up until his elbow knocked against a metal shelf. The sound wasn't loud, but in a quiet basement, it might as well have been a gunshot. What was that? Officer Mercer's voice sharpened. Andre didn't wait. He stopped the recording and slipped it into his pocket, then silently moved to a different storage room, pretending to search through boxes. His hands trembled as he heard footsteps in the hallway. "Someone else is down here," Officer Delaney called out. Andre took a deep breath and lifted a box of children's art supplies. "Hello," he called out, trying to sound casual. "Is someone there?" "I'm just grabbing some materials for tomorrow's program." Officer Delaney appeared in the doorway, his face tight with suspicion. "What are you doing down here so late?" Andre shrugged, willing his expression to remain neutral. "Grant deadline tomorrow. Need these supplies to finish the budget projection." He held up the box. "You here for the community meeting room? It's already closed up for tonight." Delaney studied him carefully. "Just doing a security check. Make sure to lock up when you leave." After they left, Andre sat alone in his office, staring at his phone. The 20-minute recording captured everything: names, dates, details of their operation. It was dangerous information. Information that could get him killed. He made 3 copies, one uploaded to a secure cloud account, one on a flash drive hidden at his sister's house, and one in a sealed envelope mailed to himself for timestamp purposes. Insurance, he told himself, just in case. He never imagined that 3 months later, in case would become reality. The jail cell was cold and smelled of bleach and sweat. Andre had barely slept, his mind racing through options. His court-appointed attorney, Diane Lee, sat across from him in the visitation room, her face showing concern as she flipped through the police report. "They're saying they found 20 grams of cocaine in your glove compartment," she said, adjusting her glasses. "That's enough to charge you with intent to distribute, not just possession." Andre leaned forward. "It wasn't mine. They planted it. I've never touched drugs in my life." Diane sighed. She'd heard this before from countless clients. I believe you, but we need more than your word against 2 officers. What about my record? I run youth programs. I speak at schools about staying away from drugs. Anyone who knows me. Character witnesses might help, but she hesitated. Judge Reynolds has a reputation. He doesn't look kindly on drug cases especially. Her voice trailed off. Especially when the defendant is black. Andrew finished for her. She nodded slightly. The prosecution is pushing for no bail. They're painting you as a community figure who used his position to distribute drugs to vulnerable neighborhoods. Andrew felt sick. That's exactly the opposite of everything I stand for. I know, but District Attorney Walsh is working closely with the judge on this one. They'd fast-tracked your case. Andrew studied her face. She seemed genuine, but could he trust her? His freedom, his life, might depend on it. There's something you should know, he said finally. I have evidence that Judge Reynolds and those 2 officers are corrupt. They're running a scheme stealing drug evidence and selling it back on the streets. Diane's eyes widened. That's a serious accusation. I have proof. A recording I made 3 months ago when I accidentally overheard them planning their operation. Where is this recording? Not here. It's hidden. I made copies. Diane lowered her voice. If what you are saying is true, these are dangerous people. They could make your evidence disappear, or you. That's why I need to trust you completely, Andrew said. My sister Pearl has a copy. You need to contact her, but carefully. They might be watching her too. As they spoke, the district attorney's office was building their case. Officer Delaney sat across from District Attorney Walsh, carefully reviewing his testimony. We received an anonymous tip about drug activity, Delaney explained, rehearsing the story. When we pulled him over, he seemed nervous. That's when Officer Mercer spotted the bag in the glove compartment. Walsh nodded approvingly, and the defendant's reaction. Claimed it wasn't his. They all do. Delaney smirked. But his fingerprints were on the glove compartment. Of course they were, Walsh said. It's his car. Neither man mentioned that there were no fingerprints on the bag itself. Across town, Officer Mercer was visiting potential witnesses from the community center. He wasn't in uniform, but his presence was intimidating nonetheless. I'd reconsider testifying for Mr. Williams, he told Tyrone Jackson, one of the youth program volunteers. We have evidence he was running drugs through that center. You wouldn't want to be connected to something like that. One by one, Andrew's character witnesses received similar visits. By evening, 3 had called Diane to withdraw their support. Back in her office, Diane reviewed Andrew's case file, troubled by the inconsistencies. The officer's report was too clean, too perfect. And why was Judge Reynolds so personally involved in a routine drug case? Her office phone rang. It was Pearl, Andrew's sister. I found what Andrew told you about, she said quietly. But someone broke into my apartment today. They didn't take my TV or jewelry. They were looking for something specific. Are you safe? Diane asked. For now. I moved the item to a better location, but I'm scared. These people seem to know every move we make. We need to authenticate that recording without the prosecution knowing it exists, Diane said. And we need to do it quickly. Andrew's arraignment is tomorrow, and I'm worried about what might happen if he stays in custody much longer. As she hung up, Diane noticed a black SUV parked across from her office. It hadn't been there earlier. She quickly closed her blinds, her heart pounding. Andrew wasn't just fighting for his freedom now. This had become something much more dangerous. Diane worked through the night in her small office, the glow of her computer screen illuminating stacks of case files. She had pulled every case where Judge Reynolds had worked with Officers Delaney and Mercer. The pattern was impossible to miss once she started looking. 27 cases in the past 18 months. 22 defendants were black men. 19 had no prior records. All were arrested on drug charges based on anonymous tips. All had evidence discovered by the same 2 officers. All received unusually harsh sentences from Judge Reynolds. This isn't coincidence, she whispered to herself, pinning photos and notes to her office wall. This is a system. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Pearl. Got the package. Meet at Rosie's Diner at 7 a.m. The diner was nearly empty when Diane arrived. Pearl sat in a back booth, a manila envelope on the table beneath her hands. Dark circles under her eyes showed she hadn't slept either. "Someone followed me home from work yesterday," Pearl said quietly as Diane slid into the booth. "Same black SUV that was parked outside your office." Diane nodded. "They're watching all of us." "Will this help, Andre?" Pearl slid the envelope across the table. Inside was a flash drive. Diane connected it to her phone and listened through earbuds. The recording was clear, 3 distinct voices discussing planting evidence, manipulating cases, and selling confiscated drugs. She recognized Judge Reynolds' voice immediately from court. "This is exactly what we need," Diane said. "But we have to be careful how we use it. These men control the local system. We need outside help." "Who can we trust?" "I have a contact at the State Attorney General's office, but it will take time to get them involved, and Andrew's arraignment is today." Pearl's phone buzzed. Her face went pale as she read the message. "Someone left this note on my son's car at his school." She turned the phone to show Diane a photo of a handwritten message. "Drop the case or your family pays." "They're getting desperate," Diane said. "That means we're on the right track." Back at the jail, Andre paced in his cell. The arraignment was in 2 hours. He barely slept, jumping at every sound in the night, wondering if Delaney or Mercer might come to ensure his silence permanently. A guard approached. "Williams, you have a visitor." Instead of being taken to the usual visitation room, Andrew was led to a small conference room. Diane was already there. "We don't have much time," she said once they were alone. "I authenticated the recording. It's them, and it proves everything you said." Relief washed over Andrew. "So we can use it in court today?" "It's not that simple. If we present this evidence to Judge Reynolds himself, he could rule it inadmissible or even destroy it. We need to get the case moved to a different judge first." "How do we do that?" "I've filed a motion for recusal, but Reynolds will fight it. And I'm worried about your safety in here. The officers have access to this facility." Andrew lowered his voice. "Last night, 2 inmates told me I should watch my back. They've never spoken to me before." Diane reached into her briefcase and pulled out a sealed envelope. "This contains a copy of the recording and documentation of the pattern I found. I'm sending copies to 3 different news outlets and the FBI field office. If anything happens to you, or if the judge denies my motion, these will be delivered immediately." Andre nodded. "Insurance." "More than that, it's justice for everyone they framed." She hesitated. "There's something else. They've threatened Pearl's family." Andrew's jaw tightened. "My nephew. He's safe. Pearl moved him to her cousin's house out of town. But we need to be prepared for them to get more desperate." As they spoke, Judge Reynolds met with District Attorney Walsh in his chambers. "The attorney is asking too many questions," the judge said. "She's pulled records of our previous cases." "Delaney says she met with the sister this morning," Walsh replied. "They might have the recording." The judge slammed his fist on the desk. "Find it, and make sure Williams doesn't make it to trial. Arrange something in the jail. Make it look like a fight with another inmate." Neither man noticed the court clerk standing just outside the door, her eyes wide with shock at what she'd just overheard. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as Andrew was led in, hands cuffed in front of him. He scanned the gallery and spotted Pearl sitting near the back, her face tight with worry. Diane stood at the defense table, arranging papers with calm precision that didn't match the storm in her eyes. Judge Reynolds entered, and the bailiff called for all to rise. Andrew noted how the judge avoided looking directly at him, instead shuffling papers on the bench with unusual focus. "Case number 47,293, State versus Andrew Williams," the clerk announced. "Your Honor," Diane began immediately, "the defense moves for your recusal from this case due to conflict of interest." The judge's face hardened. "On what grounds, Counselor?" "Evidence suggests Your Honor has personal connections to the arresting officers that compromise impartiality in this matter." "That's a serious accusation without merit," Judge Reynolds snapped. Motion denied. Diane stood her ground. "Then I'd like to enter this into evidence." She held up a flash drive. "This contains a recording of Your Honor meeting with Officers Delaney and Mercer at the community center 3 months ago, discussing the planting of evidence and tampering with drug cases." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. District Attorney Walsh jumped to his feet. Objection. This is outrageous and slanderous. Approach the bench, the judge ordered, his face ashen. As the attorneys moved forward, a young woman slipped into the courtroom and handed a note to the bailiff, who read it and frowned. At the bench, Judge Reynolds leaned forward, voiced low with menace. Ms. Lee, I suggest you withdraw that claim immediately, or I'll hold you in contempt. I've authenticated the recording, Your Honor, and I've documented a pattern in 27 of your cases where these officers provided evidence that led to convictions, primarily of black defendants with no prior records. The judge's knuckles whitened on his gavel. This hearing is in recess. We'll continue in my chambers. Now. As they moved toward the side door, the bailiff approached Judge Reynolds and whispered something. The judge froze, then glared at Diane. What have you done? He hissed. Diane looked genuinely confused. I don't understand. Your Honor, the bailiff said louder, there are federal agents here with a warrant. The back doors of the courtroom swung open. 2 men and a woman in dark suits entered, badges visible. Judge Victor Reynolds, the lead agent, announced, We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of conspiracy, evidence tampering, and bracketeering. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Officer Delaney, who had been sitting in the gallery, stood up and reached inside his jacket. The female agent drew her weapon. Hands where I can see them, officer, she commanded. Delaney slowly raised his hands. This is a mistake, he said, but his face told a different story. Andrew watched in stunned silence as federal agents placed Judge Reynolds in handcuffs. In the gallery, he spotted the court clerk who had been present when the judge entered, the same one who had passed the note to the bailiff. She gave Andre a small, firm nod. The clerk, Diane whispered, following his gaze. She must have overheard something and reported it. As Reynolds was led past the defense table, he locked eyes with Andre. You think this is over, he whispered. This goes higher than you know. The lead federal agent approached Andre and Diane. Mr. Williams, we'd like to speak with you. Your recording was brought to our attention this morning, but we've been investigating this circuit for months. We believe Judge Reynolds and these officers are part of a larger corruption network. What happens now? Andre asked, still processing the sudden turn of events. First, we're asking for all charges against you to be dismissed immediately, the agent said. Then we need your help building a case against everyone involved. Diane placed a hand on Andrew's shoulder. You should know, they threatened his family. There might be others in danger. The female agent nodded. We've already sent protection to your sister's residence, and Officer Mercer was taken into custody at his home 20 minutes ago. The district attorney stood frozen by the prosecution table, his face drained of color as he watched his career crumbling before his eyes. Walsh, Andrew said, nodding toward him. He's part of this too. We know, the agent replied. His arrest is next. As the handcuffs were removed from Andrew's wrists, he rubbed the marks they'd left behind. Freedom felt strange after days in jail, but the fight was far from over. The judge's words echoed in his mind. This goes higher than you know. The federal building downtown hummed with activity as Andre sat in a conference room with Special Agent Rivera and Diane. Maps and photos covered the walls, faces connected by red strings, locations marked with pins. Andre recognized Judge Reynolds, Officers Delaney and Mercer, and District Attorney Walsh among the photos. But there were many others he didn't know. We've been tracking this operation for 8 months, Agent Rivera explained, tapping a map of the city divided into colored zones. Your recording was the missing piece. Before that, we had patterns and suspicions, but no solid evidence of the judge's involvement. Andre leaned forward, studying the map. These zones match neighborhood divisions in the city. Exactly. Each color represents territory controlled by different dealers, all operating under protection from corrupt officials. The system was clever. Officers would arrest rival dealers, then plant evidence on innocent people from those neighborhoods to create fear and control. And Judge Reynolds would ensure convictions, Diane added. Agent Rivera nodded. Over 60 cases in 3 years. Mostly young black men with no priors, given maximum sentences. Andre felt sick. How many innocent people are still in prison? We're reviewing every case, but we need your testimony to make it stick. A knock at the door interrupted them. Another agent entered, her expression grim. "We've got a problem. Officer Mercer is offering to talk." "That's good news, isn't it?" Andre asked. "Not exactly. He's claiming the recording was edited. Says you fabricated evidence to frame them because they caught you with drugs." "That's ridiculous." Andre stood up, fists clenched. Diane touched his arm. "Calm down. This is exactly what we expected." "They're desperate." Agent Rivera's phone buzzed. She checked it and smiled slightly. "Well, Officer Delaney just made a different offer. He wants immunity in exchange for testifying against both Mercer and Reynolds." "They're turning on each other," Diane said. "Happens every time." Agent Rivera turned to Andra. "We need to move fast before they coordinate their stories. I'd like you to make a formal statement now, with every detail you can remember from that night at the community center." As Andra began recounting his story, across town at the county jail, Judge Reynolds sat in an isolation cell. His expensive suit had been replaced with an orange jumpsuit, his status doing nothing to protect him from the system he once controlled. His lawyer, a nervous man with thinning hair, sat across from him in the visitation room. "They have a recording, Victor. It's bad, really bad." "It was a setup," the judge insisted. "That community organizer edited the tape." "Audio experts have already authenticated it," the lawyer replied. "And now Delaney's talking. He says you were the mastermind, that you selected which defendants to target based on their race and neighborhood." Reynolds slammed his hand on the table. "He's lying to save himself." "The FBI has bank records, Victor. Regular deposits to offshore accounts in your name. They've frozen everything." The judge's face fell as the reality of his situation sank in. "What are my options?" "Cooperate. Tell them who else is involved." The lawyer leaned closer. "They think this goes higher, to the commissioner, maybe even judges on the circuit court. If you're the first to give them names." Meanwhile, in the federal building's basement garage, Agent Rivera escorted Andre and Diane to a waiting car. "We'll have agents outside your home and your sister's place until this is over," she explained. "Don't go anywhere without letting us know first." "How long will this take?" Andre asked. "The grand jury convenes tomorrow. With your testimony and the recording, we should have indictments by the end of the week." As they reached the car, Andre noticed a news van pulling up to the federal building. A reporter and cameraman jumped out, rushing toward the entrance. "Word's getting out," Diane said. Agent Rivera nodded. "By morning, this will be everywhere. The biggest judicial corruption case this city has seen in decades." Andre watched the reporter disappear into the building. "Those men tried to bury me. They never expected I'd be the one to bring them down. The system they corrupted will now be used to bring them to justice," Diane said. "There's poetry in that." As their car pulled away, Andre felt a weight lifting. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to hope, not just for his own freedom, but for all those still trapped by the corruption he'd exposed. 1 year later, Andre stood at the podium in the community center's newly renovated main hall. Sunlight streamed through fresh windows, illuminating the faces of over 100 people gathered for the opening of the Justice Reform Center. Behind him sat Pearl, Diane, and Agent Rivera, along with several men and women who had been freed from prison after their cases were reviewed. "When I was arrested that night," Andrew began, his voice steady, "I thought my life was over. Those men had all the power, badges, gavels, political connections. They had everything except one thing, the truth." The crowd murmured in agreement. Several nodded, their own experiences reflected in his words. "The truth was my only weapon." A 20-minute recording that I made by accident became the key to exposing corruption that had infected our justice system for years. In the front row, a young man named Theo wiped away tears. He had spent 2 years in prison before Andrew's evidence led to his case being overturned. 23 others had similar stories, lives derailed by the corrupt scheme, now slowly being rebuilt. "Today marks a new beginning," Andrew continued. "This center will provide legal support to those who can't afford it, investigation services for questionable convictions, and counseling for families torn apart by unjust incarceration. The settlement from the city won't erase the harm done, but it will fund our work for years to come." Across town in the federal courthouse, a very different scene unfolded. Judge Reynolds stood before the bench in his orange jumpsuit, shoulders slumped as the federal judge delivered his sentence. 25 years in federal prison, the judge pronounced, her voice firm. Your betrayal of public trust and the racial targeting of defendants represents one of the most egregious abuses of judicial power this court has ever seen. Officers Delaney and Mercer had already received their sentences, 18 and 15 years respectively, reduced from potential life sentences in exchange for their testimony against higher officials. District Attorney Walsh had taken a similar deal, revealing connections that led to the police commissioner and 2 other judges. The ripples continued to spread. 47 convictions had been overturned so far, with dozens more under review. The Department of Justice had appointed a special oversight committee for the entire county's criminal justice system. Back at the community center, Andrew stepped away from the podium to thunderous applause. People lined up to shake his hand, many sharing their own stories of injustice or thanking him for giving them hope. Pearl embraced him tightly. "Mom and Dad would be so proud," she whispered. Diane approached, smiling. She had left the public defender's office to join Andrew's new center as lead attorney. "The governor just signed the Wrongful Conviction Act," she told him. "It streamlines the process for reviewing questionable cases and provides compensation for those exonerated." "So something good came from all this," Andrew said. Agent Rivera joined them, now in civilian clothes. She had taken early retirement from the FBI to help train community members to identify and document potential corruption. "I just heard from my former colleagues," she said. "The investigation has spread to 3 neighboring counties. This might become one of the largest corruption cases in state history." Andrew nodded, feeling both satisfaction and sadness. How many lives were damaged before someone finally stopped them? "That's why this center matters," Diane said, gesturing around them, "to make sure it never happens again." As the celebration continued, Andrew stepped outside for a moment of quiet. The evening air was cool on his face as he looked up at the stars. He thought about how close he had come to losing everything: his freedom, his reputation, perhaps even his life. One piece of evidence, kept hidden until the right moment, had changed everything. Now that same approach would help others find justice. From the community center behind him came the sounds of laughter and hope, people who had suffered under a corrupt system now working together to rebuild it. Andrew smiled and turned back toward the light and noise, ready to continue the work that had found him, rather than the other way around. Sometimes, he thought, the most powerful weapon against injustice isn't shouting louder, it's holding onto the truth until the perfect moment to reveal it.